This is a very ambitious topic, Trump in the Middle East a year later. I thought that for this not to be another superficial talk, I would focus really on one issue. And that one issue has to do with the Trump promise, or in my more optimistic moments, especially a year ago, I saw as the Trump promise to achieve a breakthrough in Israeli-Palestinian relations, to solve the conflict. So this is what I'm going to talk about now. And what I will focus on is what I'll divide my words into three subtopics. One is, what were the conditions over this past few months? What were the conditions that allowed somebody like myself to be as optimistic, relatively to other people, about the prospect that this administration would actually achieve something significant in this realm, which is to say, in the efforts to achieve this breakthrough? Why would I have thought that there is a chance that Trump has at least a chance of doing something significant here? So that's number one. Number two is, what was the Trump administration's team, the team that the president actually appointed, led by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his chief negotiator, Jason Greenblatt? What was the thinking behind that fueled the efforts of the team until now? When I say until now, what I really mean is until a few days just prior to the president's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And so the third topic, and my final topic, will be why in the world did President Trump decide to make that announcement at the present time? And what are the effects of this announcement? So these are the three topics. Why? What were the conditions? Why would anybody believe? Why would anybody like me believe that there is a chance for a breakthrough? What was the thinking behind the team's approach to this? And third, why? Why the announcement at this time, and what are the consequences of the announcement? So for the first topic, the first two topics are the good news, and the third, not so good. The first topic, what were the conditions? Why would anybody believe that the administration had a chance to achieve a breakthrough? First of all, because President Trump seemed really committed, really intrigued to achieve such a breakthrough. He repeated this as late as September in the various pronouncements that began, by the way, during the campaign. It then moved into after he was elected and before his team went into the White House, and then ever since. And as I said, as late as September, in two separate occasions during the UN General Assembly, not in the framework of his speech, but in different announcements, he repeated again and again that he is well aware that people said, historically, everybody's tried this, everybody's failed, and so this is like doomed to failure. And he said, I don't think so. I think we can achieve a breakthrough. So he seemed committed, not because, in my view, because he doesn't sleep at night because of Israel's fate, or doesn't sleep at night because of the plight of the Palestinians, but because he was really intrigued by the idea of achieving something that eluded all of his predecessors. But I think personal ambition is a strong motivation. So that's number one. Number two, there are three characteristics of this particular president that I thought might be particularly helpful in achieving this breakthrough. They may have been among the things I said a year ago, but I'm not a historian, so I can't remember what I said. The first thing that I thought, and some of these characteristics of this particular president are seen by many of my colleagues as disadvantages, downsides. And I think for the particular mission that we're talking about, they may be actually pluses. They may actually be helpful. The first is he is a very impatient man. And actually being impatient in this particular case is not a disadvantage. In fact, I think administrations, including the last administration, including the Obama administration, but previously also the Clinton administration, has been far too patient with Israeli and Palestinian leaders who, whenever they did not want to make, and they did not apparently want to make the difficult decisions, to make the painful concessions that are required to achieve a deal, what they did is that they mounted all kinds of preconditions for negotiations. In fact, if you look at the last years of the Obama administration, the so-called John Kerry mission, most of the time Kerry actually didn't deal with what the Trump administration calls the deal. He actually dealt with the preconditions that both sides mounted on each other. The Palestinians, for example, demanded that Israel stop settlement construction in the territories. They also demanded that Israel release Palestinian prisoners as conditions for negotiations. And Israel basically demanded that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Again, it wasn't clear whether it was a precondition for negotiations or a precondition for achieving an agreement, but it definitely was not negotiations of the agreement itself. Well, there is no chance, in my view, that Trump is going to engage in any conversation about preconditions. And in fact, both parties have got the message. The Palestinians, remarkably, since Trump came into office, dropped any conversation about settlement construction freeze and release of prisoners as preconditions for negotiations. So that's number one. The second character of Trump is his inattention to details. Now, his inattention to detail, I always thought, was a big advantage. Why? Because the other thing that Israeli and Palestinian leaders were very, very good at, they excelled in it. Whenever they didn't want to achieve an agreement, or rather didn't want to make the concessions necessary to achieve an agreement, they perfected to a form of art, drowning each other and especially drowning the American facilitators in endless details. Well, I don't think this is a president that will tolerate this kind of strategy. And the third advantage of President Trump is that he at least considers himself a master in marketing. That means that also that either Israeli or Palestinian leaders or both, well, one thing that, again, when they didn't want to make the concessions that are required for a deal to be achieved, said, as early as Camp David, and if not before, of 2000, was there is no chance of selling, quote unquote, these concessions to their respective publics. Well, Trump will just say, I'll tell you how to sell it to your publics. So I thought these three combinations, this impatience, this inattention to detail, the fact that he knows something about marketing, could be a big advantage. Okay, that's the president. The regional circumstances, in my view, also were quite positive in a number of respects for the regional environment for a breakthrough in Israeli-Palestinian relations. One is the fact that countries, states, regimes in the region that traditionally were spoilers and made it more difficult to achieve an agreement are basically gone or embroiled in civil wars to the extent that they are no longer capable of becoming or serving or playing the role of spoilers as they have. Syria, Iraq, Libya under Gaddafi, these three regimes played a significant role in spoiling such efforts. So that's number one. The second aspect of the region is that the fact that these countries, and if you can add Yemen, not a terribly significant player, but still, we have four actors that were unitary actors, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, are no longer there. The balance of power in the region has shifted to the more pragmatic, I purposely don't say moderate, more pragmatic players in the region. So what emerged here is essentially the importance of the so-called Arab Quartet. Who are the members of the Arab Quartet, or who leads the Arab Quartet? Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates. And what is common to these countries, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Jordan, and Egypt, is that now increasingly they have common interests with Israel. And the common interest is to deal with the expanding influence of Iran in the region. These countries see Iran as a great threat to them. And they recognize that there is a common denominator on this issue with Israel. So that's number two. Number three, the Arab street, so-called, which is public opinion in Arab countries, is no longer a serious impediment to peace with Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that Arab publics are happy to sign to the Israeli Declaration of Independence. But what it does mean is that Arab publics are not really motivated today to oppose a deal with Israel. Partly it's because of accumulative fatigue with the Israeli-Palestinian, what some in the region called quarrel. Part of it has to do with the Palestinian internal rifts, primarily between the secular nationalists that are headed by Mahmoud Abbas, Fatah, and so on, and the Islamists headed by Hamas. And the fact that now the Palestinians are completely split, Hamas essentially has control of Gaza, the Palestinian Authority has control of the West Bank, that over time has created an Arab street reaction that says basically, if the struggle against Israel was so important to you, the Palestinians, how come you're engaged in this internal struggle, this internal quarrel, and you can't find within yourself the power and the motivation to unify against the so-called Israeli threat? You're coming to us, Arabs in Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, to support you in the struggle against Israel, but it seems from your day-to-day behavior that your internal quarrels are more important to you than the struggle against Israel. Now, these shifts are very, very, very important. The shifts in the region are very important to achieve a breakthrough in Israeli-Palestinian relations, because there are some aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian struggle or conflict that don't have a solution except in a regional framework. Okay? At least two very, very important issues cannot be fully addressed without the region. One is Jerusalem, because many Arab publics and many Arab states have a stake in the Jerusalem issue. Certainly Jordan actually the Jordanian importance in the Jerusalem issue has been recognized by Israel in the framework of the 1994 Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. Saudi Arabia certainly sees itself as having a very strong interest in the religious, in the important sites in Jerusalem. And even Morocco. Why Morocco? Because in the Conference of Islamic States, Morocco actually holds the so-called Jerusalem portfolio. The second issue that has no resolution outside the region or without the region's participation is the refugees issue. Because there is no solution to the Palestinian refugees issue without important Arab countries playing an important role in settling Palestinian refugees on their territory. Palestinian refugees comprise at least half of the population of Jordan, and they comprise an important, although not demographically, not with such numbers, in Lebanon and in other places. So the shift in the region for greater pragmatism, for a greater common denominator, common interest with Israel is very, very important to achieve a breakthrough. Finally, in terms of the conditions for an agreement, are the domestic scenes in both Israel and among Palestinians. The domestic constituencies in Israel and among the Palestinians are definitely today not a force for peace. They're not a force for peace. Support for a two-state solution has declined over the years from over 70% when the Oslo Accords were signed to below 50%. But at the same time, these domestic constituencies, what we sometimes more often refer to as public opinion in both Israel and among the Palestinians, are also not an absolute impediment to an agreement. So the most recent research of my principal Palestinian colleague, Khalil Shikaki, who runs the Palestinian Center for Political and Survey Research in Ramallah, he and a team of Israeli researchers have essentially administered surveys to both Israelis and Palestinians with similar questions, or questions that have a similar character. And what they try to see is, can you actually boost support right now, despite everything, from below 50% among Israelis and Palestinians to way up as high as the 70s by adding to the deal incentives. In other words, if you told Israelis and Palestinians, the deal, would you support the deal if the deal is accompanied by X, Y, and Z incentives? And they try to test also, what do the publics care most about? So it turns out, for example, not surprising to people who've been dealing with this for the last 3.5 decades, that, for example, the Palestinians care a lot about the issue of prisoner release. So it's actually not too surprising that John Kerry engaged in these endless discussions about prisoner release, because it turns out that Palestinian prisoners who are in Israeli jails or detention centers, the issue of Palestinian prisoners is affecting almost every Palestinian family. Almost every Palestinian knows somebody in the extended family who is now in jail. So when you tell Palestinians, well, will you support this deal if the deal is associated by a total release of prisoners? That's not part of the deal. It's an incentive around the deal. Support increases dramatically. If you tell Israelis, if the deal is accompanied by Arab recognition, that is to say, not just Palestinian recognition, but regional recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. In other words, not just recognition of Israel as a fact that one has to deal with, but as a Jewish state, support increases again beyond 70%. And there's a caveat which is very, very interesting. One there are many incentives that were tested on both Palestinian publics and Israeli publics. One which not many people would have expected would have such an effect on public opinion was if the deal is accompanied by compensation to Jews who lived in Arab countries, in Morocco, in Iraq, in Algeria, in Tunis. Compensation for their loss of property, the property they essentially left behind when they themselves became refugees in 1949, 50, 51, 52. This is again when this was tested, you saw that support for the deal also increased dramatically. Now, why this is so important actually from a standpoint of analyzing Israeli domestic politics is because the demography of Likud voters, of the voters of the party that Netanyahu heads, is approximately 2/3 of Likud voters are people who immigrated or are children of people who immigrated from Arab countries, or oftentimes we refer to them as Sephardic Jews rather than Ashkenazi Jews. So the point about this is that number one, the publics right now are not a force for peace, but they are also not an impediment for peace. And if the deal is associated with a package of incentives, support for the deal can be increased dramatically. So this is the first of the three issues I wanted to discuss with you. One is the conditions for a deal in terms of the nature, the character of the president who was said to be interested in making this deal or navigating this process, the other aspects of the region, and domestic politics or the opinions among Israelis and Palestinians. Okay, so that's the one. The second issue is, what's the thinking behind, or what was the thinking behind the administration plans to come up with this deal or the breakthrough that Trump was just talking about over this past year? Now, this was very, very, very difficult to ascertain. And the reason it was very difficult to ascertain is that remarkably, again, any one of you who followed politics in Washington over the last 3.5 decades or 4 decades knows that Washington, just like Israel, is extremely, extremely leaky. Okay? It's very difficult to keep a secret in Washington. I used to say that the difference between top secret and unclassified in either Israel or Washington is 72 hours. Now, in this environment, what was really remarkable is that this team that the president appointed, his son-in-law, Jason Greenblatt, a team in the National Security Council supporting them and some others, have leaked nothing, zero, for almost a year. Okay, 0 leaks about what this deal is going to look like, what their thinking is, what their approach is. Now, in this, there was a small breakthrough, not so small, not in my view so small, that very few people paid attention to. And it just happened to have taken place 2 days before Trump made the Jerusalem announcement. Jared Kushner, who, as I said nothing over these months, gave an interview at something called the Saban Forum of the Brookings Institution, which is a very important Israeli-American dialogue that takes place in Washington, D.C. Every year. He gave an extensive interview for half an hour. You can go on YouTube and you can watch it. I've actually watched it many times because originally there was no transcript, so I had to play it many times to make sure that I got all the points. Okay, Kushner actually didn't reveal any details about the deal, but he revealed something very important instead, which is what are the pillars of the approach? What is the thinking that fuels the plan to come up with this initiative? And so Kushner basically talked about 5 pillars here. First, he said, this is going to be unconventional. He said, look, this is an unconventional president. He's a president who violated all the conventions. He won the presidency by violating all the conventions about how you go about winning the presidency. So that's number one. Number two, he talked about the issue of what we call linkage, which is, so why is this important? Now, here it goes beyond the issue of the personal ambition of the president. There has been a debate in Washington over decades about the so-called issue of linkage. What is the so-called issue of linkage? The so-called issue of linkage is, what is the linkage between resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and dealing or addressing America's other challenges in the Middle East? And this has been a subject of huge debate among the expert community in Washington, D.C. My good friends, Dennis Ross and David Makovsky, published a book a few years ago that revolved around this one issue, and they rejected this concept of linkage. Jared Kushner came very clearly on the side of the argument that there is a linkage. And his explanation of why they're engaged in this, it was, America has huge challenges in the region, and to deal with these other challenges, to address these other issues, the US has to resolve this question, because this question is an impediment. The lack of resolution of this conflict is an impediment for other Arab countries that the US needs to address these other issues and their willingness to support. So in terms of, he was very clear as to what the motivation is. The motivation is to create the conditions that would allow Arab countries to provide greater support for America's other challenges in the region. So that's number two. Number three, he talked about the so-called, so everybody, okay, so if I were to go from, start in kindergarten level, I would talk about an impediment to an agreement called the trust deficit. The fact that Israelis and Palestinians don't trust each other anymore. Kushner was very interesting about this. He said there is a very deep trust deficit between the leaders, the Israeli leaders and the Palestinian leaders, the Palestinian leaders and Israeli leaders. But he said, we don't consider that there is a huge trust deficit between Israelis and Palestinians. Again, Israelis and Palestinians in contrast to Israeli leaders and Palestinian leaders. And he said, we are impressed that there are many projects at the people-to-people level, cooperative projects between Israelis and Palestinians that are quite fascinating. And so he gave that as an example to say, hey, that's not an impediment. In fact, the problem we have is with the leaders, not necessarily with the people. The fourth pillar, the fourth point that he made was, he said this. He said, and now go back to the comparison I made with the Kerry mission and their willingness to engage in conversations or endless negotiations with the parties on preconditions for negotiations. And Jared Kushner said something very clear, and he said it again and again and again. We are focused on only one issue, and the one issue is the deal. We are not going to engage ourselves. Remember what I said earlier about the inattention to details and so on and so forth? He said, we are not going to allow ourselves to be distracted by side issues. I call them preconditions. And he said, and he had a rather colorful language here. He said, we are not going to chase rabbits. And he said, even when the rabbits are elephant size, we are not going to chase these rabbits. Okay, we're focused on, we are deliberate, we're zeroing in on only one issue. What are the components of a deal that would end this conflict. And the fifth point that he made, the fifth pillar of the approach, is we are not going to stop by presenting an initiative. We are going to remain engaged with this to see through the implementation of the agreement. And we're going to surround the agreement with an incentive structure. Remember what I said about the polls that were made about gauging the potential support of the publics if you add incentives. And he actually, in this case, was very specific. He named then the Deputy National Security Advisor, Dina Powell, and he said she is entrusted, by the way, she's Egyptian-born American, comes from Goldman Sachs, now she's back associated with Goldman Sachs. He said, we have entrusted her to come up with an incentive structure to ensure the parties' continued commitment to implement the deal. So in other words, what he was saying is, this is not going to end with us proclaiming a deal. We are going to engage in this the day after, and the day after, the day after, and the day after, the day after. Now, I have to say that, all of my colleagues have been very skeptical about, whether the Trump administration was serious, and I stuck my neck out. And I have to say that, and again, I've been following these issues for almost 4 decades. And I was impressed that Kushner basically conveyed the notion persuasively, at least for my taste, compellingly, at least for me, that they have thought seriously and deeply about these issues. You can agree with him, you can disagree with him. Again, many of my colleagues in Washington, D.C. would disagree with the idea that there is a real linkage, but one could not deny, after this half-an-hour interview, that this team had worked hard, thought seriously about this issue. I'm going overtime. Okay, unfortunately, there's also bad news. The bad news is, and this is really, for me, it's a real puzzle. I don't have an answer to the question that I will pose to you and with which I will end, which is, why did Trump come out with a statement recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital? Now, I say this as somebody who was born in Jerusalem. My family is 5 generations from Jerusalem. He is also, by the way, was correct in his response afterwards when he said, all I did was recognize a fact. That's true. But recognizing this fact has also political significance. And the question is not whether it was, whether there was justification or there is justification for the U.S. To recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. That's not the question. The question is, why did he decide to issue the statement now, which is to say, outside the initiative that Jared Kushner was talking about? This was going to be a very important component of the deal itself. So why make this statement, which clearly was a pro-Israeli statement, it was biased towards Israel, why essentially separate this issue from the other components of the deal? The only explanation that I can give is that this had nothing to do, or in his mind, this has nothing to do with his other objective, which is to achieve a breakthrough, and everything to do with his notions about what his political base wanted to hear. And I'm referring mostly to the evangelical community. Now, the reason, if this is the explanation, that of course puts a huge shadow over everything that I told you in the last 30 minutes. Because if Trump cares so much about this base, then I can tell you there is zero chance for the initiative that Jared Kushner talks about for ever succeeding, because any deal between Israel and the Palestinians would require very painful concessions, not only from the Palestinians, but also from Israel. And if the commitment to the base, to the evangelical base, is so strong, That means that that essentially the president is not willing or will not be willing to essentially to try to get Israel to make the concessions that are needed for the deal to be concluded. Now, it's also possible that somehow Trump received advice either from Prime Minister Netanyahu or even more likely from some Arab leaders that led him to believe that either the Palestinian reaction would not be very strong or that the Arab reaction, by the way, which indeed wasn't very strong, and that therefore the Palestinian negative reaction to the statement could be overcome. If so, this was a colossal intelligence misassessment. The reality is that now this statement has created a situation that the Palestinian President Abbas has been completely discredited. He himself said, instead of the quote-unquote ultimate deal, we received the ultimate slap. And so the result of this is that in many Palestinian eyes, the United States, or this particular administration, has disqualified itself from being able to serve any constructive role in attempting to resolve the conflict. My colleague Khalil Shikaki ran more public opinion polls after the Jerusalem statement, and the Jerusalem statement increased dramatically the support for violence among Palestinians. And the mute Arab response, the mute Arab negative response, which is to say Arab beyond Palestinians, the mute response, or the weak negative response, has also essentially eroded the Palestinian confidence in the Arab countries that are needed to support this deal, the so-called Arab Quartet. So from a situation where we had good reasons to believe that, in fact, the administration is very serious about an effort to resolve the conflict, only 2 days before Trump made the announcement, we are now stuck. We're now in a situation where there is this escalation in the rhetoric between the Trump administration and the Palestinians. The Trump administration is threatening to reduce support for the refugees, for UNRWA. The Palestinians refused to meet with Vice President Pence, and now Trump is pissed at the Palestinians for having slighted the Vice President. And so I warned you. 2 chapters were good news. The third, not so good.